America is drowning in debt. More than $38 trillion in federal debt is hanging over the United States, and every year the government needs to borrow even more money. At the same time, interest payments are becoming one of the largest expenses in the entire federal budget. So naturally, people are asking a terrifying question. Will America default on its debt? Will the U.S. government one day simply admit that it cannot pay what it owes? Probably not. But that does not mean the debt problem will disappear, because America has another option, one that may be politically easier than an obvious default, but potentially much more damaging to ordinary Americans. The United States can slowly reduce the real value of its debt by reducing the purchasing power of the money used to repay it. In simple words, America may never default on its debt. It may simply make your money worth less. And if that happens, the people who depend on savings, fixed incomes, wages, and cash could quietly pay the price. This is the hidden tax that almost nobody votes for, but everyone can feel. To understand why this matters, we first need to understand one important fact. A country that owes money in a foreign currency can run into a serious problem. If it cannot get enough of that foreign currency, it may eventually be unable to pay. But the United States is different. Most U.S. government debt is denominated in dollars, and the U.S. dollar is the currency of the American government. That gives the United States an extraordinary advantage. Technically, the government can always obtain more dollars. That does not mean creating more money has no consequences. It absolutely does. But it means there is a major difference between not being able to pay and paying with money that has lost purchasing power. Imagine that you lend someone $100. 10 years later, they return your full $100. On paper, they paid every dollar back. No default, no missed payment, no bankruptcy. But what if those $100 can now buy far less than they could when you originally made the loan? You received your money, but you did not receive the same purchasing power. That is the danger. The debt was repaid in nominal dollars, but the real value of the repayment was lower. And when a government has enormous debts, inflation can become an extremely powerful tool because it makes yesterday's debt easier to repay with tomorrow's cheaper dollars. This is why the debt problem is not just about government finances. It is about your personal finances. When the value of money falls, the impact spreads everywhere. Your grocery bill rises, your rent rises, insurance becomes more expensive, energy costs increase, homes become more expensive, and if your income does not rise as fast as prices, your standard of living begins to fall quietly, slowly, and almost invisibly. Now, to be clear, America cannot simply print unlimited money and erase $38 trillion in debt overnight. If it tried to do that aggressively, the consequences could be severe. Investors could lose confidence, interest rates could rise, the dollar could weaken, and inflation could become much more difficult to control. That is why the process does not necessarily look dramatic. It can happen slowly, a little more debt, a little more inflation, a little more government spending, and a little more monetary support during the next crisis. Then another crisis arrives, and another, until years pass and people suddenly realize something disturbing. They may have more dollars in their bank accounts than ever before, but those dollars buy less than they used to. That is why inflation can be described as a stealth tax. Nobody sends you a bill, nobody knocks on your door, and there is no official letter saying, "Congratulations, your savings have just lost purchasing power." Instead, you discover it at the supermarket, at the gas station, when you renew your insurance, when you try to buy a house, and when you look at the cost of raising a family. The numbers in your bank account may look the same, but the world around those numbers becomes more expensive. This is where the problem becomes especially dangerous for savers. Imagine you spent decades saving money. You avoided unnecessary debt, kept cash in the bank, worked hard, and built a nest egg. You believe that because you have saved $100,000, you have protected yourself. But protection from what? A dollar amount does not guarantee purchasing power. If inflation steadily reduces the value of money, your savings can lose real value, even while the number on your bank statement remains unchanged. This is the part many people miss. Nominal wealth is not the same as real wealth. If your savings increase by 3%, but the cost of living increases by 5%, you may technically have more money, but in real terms, you are losing ground. This becomes especially painful for people living on fixed incomes, including retirees, pensioners, people holding large amounts of cash, and workers whose wages cannot keep up with inflation. They can all experience a gradual reduction in purchasing power. Meanwhile, the largest borrower in the room may actually benefit: the government, because inflation can reduce the real burden of existing fixed-rate debt. But there is another problem. The United States does not only have a debt problem, it also has an interest problem. When interest rates rise, the government must spend more money simply servicing its existing debt. That creates a dangerous cycle. More debt can mean more interest costs. More interest costs can mean larger deficits. Larger deficits can require more borrowing, and more borrowing can eventually place pressure on interest rates. Then the cycle becomes even harder to escape. This is why America's debt situation cannot be understood by looking at the $38 trillion number alone. The more important question is, how expensive is that debt becoming to maintain? If interest costs continue consuming a larger share of government revenue, future governments may face increasingly difficult choices. They could raise taxes, cut spending, reduce entitlement programs, borrow even more, allow higher inflation, or use some combination of all of them. None of these choices are politically easy, and that is exactly why inflation can become so tempting. An obvious tax increase creates immediate political anger, and a spending cut creates immediate political anger. But inflation is more complicated. It does not arrive with one dramatic announcement. It can happen gradually, and by the time people fully understand what is happening, the purchasing power may already be gone. This does not mean a catastrophic collapse is guaranteed. America still has enormous economic strength. The United States has deep capital markets, powerful institutions, major companies, technological leadership, and the world's dominant reserve currency. The dollar remains central to the global financial system, so predicting an immediate U.S. debt default would be misleading. But ignoring the debt problem would also be dangerous. The real risk may not be a single dramatic event. It may be a long period where debt deficits, interest costs, and inflation slowly reshape the financial lives of ordinary Americans. And this is where you need to think differently. The question is no longer, will America default? The better question is, if America avoids default, who ultimately pays the cost? Because governments do not make economic problems disappear. They move the cost from taxpayers to bondholders, from savers to borrowers, from one generation to another, or from today's dollars to tomorrow's weaker dollars. Somebody always pays. So what can ordinary people do? First, understand the difference between cash and purchasing power. Cash is useful, and emergency savings are essential, but holding too much wealth in assets that cannot keep pace with inflation can create long-term risks. Second, understand your debt. Not all debt behaves the same way during inflation. High-interest debt can be financially destructive, but fixed-rate debt and assets can behave very differently when prices rise. Third, focus on productivity and earning power. In an inflationary environment, your ability to increase your income can become more important than simply trying to save every dollar. And finally, pay attention to the long-term picture. America's debt problem may not end with a dramatic announcement saying, "The United States has defaulted." It may be far quieter than that. The Treasury may continue making payments. The government may continue borrowing. The dollar may continue circulating. and life may continue normally, at least on the surface. But over time, you may notice that your paycheck does not stretch as far, your savings do not feel as secure, and the price of everything important continues moving higher. That is the possibility people should be watching, not necessarily a sudden debt default, but a slow erosion of purchasing power, because America may never refuse to pay its debts. It may simply pay them back with dollars that buy less than the dollars you earned. And if that happens, the biggest question will not be whether the government defaulted. The biggest question will be, were you prepared for the quiet tax that came after it?